Okay, welcome back. In today's lecture, we're going to talk about um, aggregate supply and aggregate demand together, and then we're going to look at equilibrium price, output, and we're going to look at inflationary gaps and recessionary gaps. So when we put aggregate supply or use aggregate supply and aggregate demand model, we want that model to show us what would happen in the short run and the long run with price and output or price level, inflation, and output GDP. And then we want to know, what is the model showing us? Is it showing us that we are in an inflationary gap, which I'll show you here in just a second? Most people know what a recessionary gap is, or are we in a recessionary gap, right? Which is kind of where we're moving right now with the coronavirus pandemic. So let's take a look at these. So let's look at an example. Here we are in a aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, which shows aggregate supply and aggregate demand equilibrium right here. We have our long run, right? So we're right here. Whoops, excuse me. We have our long run aggregate supply. We have our GDP, our output here on our x-axis, and our price level over here on our y-axis. And we are in equilibrium, right? So we're working where we are supposed to be. This is our potential GDP, our long-run aggregate supply, and everything here is, as we would say, as my old my Meemaw would say, hunky-dory. But what happens if the government increases spending? Let's imagine everything else equal, government increases spending. We have a shift in our aggregate demand, and something looks like this. So now we are producing above our potential GDP, our QY here. Now we're producing more. Our real GDP is higher than what it should be. And there we are at our price level 1 and our quantity 1. This is what we call, we get rid of that, there's our new equilibrium. This is what we call an inflationary gap. Notice that our inflationary gap is here. This is the gap. Right? Some people will say, well, it's inflationary because the price went up and it's inflationary. Well, there are times, yeah, sure. Really, I tell students to look at it more as an inflationary gap, as in that our GDP is greater than what it should be. Our potential GDP, where we're using our resources to their maximum, is here, but we are working a lot higher. Our GDP number is much higher. So output is high, GDP is high, and unemployment is less than natural rate of unemployment, meaning we have very low unemployment and very high output. So our actual GDP is above potential GDP. Let's take another look. Assume the price of oil increases drastically. What happens to price level and output? Well, we notice here that aggregate supply decreases, our price level increases, and our quantity decreases. So this is a special type of recessionary gap. We'll look at this one first before we just look at a straight up recessionary gap. This is what we call stagflation, meaning we have high prices and low output. And this is what we call a stagnant economy. It also creates something that we call a recessionary gap. Bam, there it is, right? There's our old equilibrium. Something happens in the economy in the short run, and we are stuck in a recession. Now, a recession can be caused by a decrease in aggregate supply or a decrease in aggregate demand, or both. An inflationary gap can be created by an increase in aggregate demand or an increase in aggregate supply, or both. And we have a recessionary gap. Okay. Output low, meaning we're producing fewer goods and services than we were previously, and unemployment is high. Actual GDP below potential GDP. Okay, that is what a recessionary gap looks like and an inflationary gap look like. get used to seeing those, we'll actually put some numbers with those and the following videos that I send out to you. And we'll look at how to close those gaps. So why is it important that you know what these gaps are? You need to know when we're in a recessionary period or an inflationary period, because fiscal policy will figure out how to close those gaps. What can Congress do with its budget in order to close an inflationary gap and get us back to potential GDP, or close a recessionary gap and get us back to potential GDP, so that we have a healthy, growing economy? All right, until next time.